The morning arrived softly in the small coastal town of Seabrook Haven, where the October mist rolled gently inland from the Pacific Ocean and settled among the cedar trees like a blanket of quiet silver. The kind of mist that softened every edge and muffled every sound, the kind that made the world feel wrapped in cotton wool and whispered promises of rest, of peace, of the slow unfolding of a new day that asked nothing of anyone except that they simply be present in its gentle embrace. Daniel Chen stood at the window of his small apartment above the bookshop, watching the fog curl between the weathered buildings of Main Street, his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of green tea that had belonged to his mother, his birth mother, the only thing he had ever had of hers, a simple white cup with a hand-painted crane in faded blue, its glaze crackled with age and use and love. The steam rose from the tea in delicate spirals that seemed to dance with the mist beyond the glass, and Daniel felt that familiar morning feeling of being suspended between two worlds, the world of sleep and the world of waking, the world of what had been and the world of what might yet be. He was 34 years old, though people often said he looked younger, perhaps because of the softness in his eyes, the gentle way he smiled, the unhurried manner in which he moved through the world, as though each moment deserved its own careful attention. His hair was black and straight, falling just past his ears in the careless way of someone who rarely thought about such things, and his face held the quiet beauty of mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and warm brown eyes that spoke of his Chinese birth mother, the gentle curve of his jaw that remained a mystery, a question mark in the shape of a face, since he had never known his father. The apartment was small but warm, filled with the soft amber light of a vintage lamp that cast pools of gold across towers of books that lined every wall, spilled across every surface, stacked beside the worn leather armchair where Daniel spent his evenings reading, lost in worlds far from this quiet coastal town. The furniture was old but comfortable, pieces he had found at estate sales and thrift stores over the years, each one carrying its own history, its own stories, each one chosen not for its value, but for the way it seemed to belong, the way it fit into the gentle atmosphere he had created in this modest space above his bookshop. Chen's Pages, the shop was called, a name that had felt too simple when he first painted it on the wooden sign that hung above the door, but which had grown on him over the years, had come to feel right in the way that simple, honest things often do. The shop occupied the ground floor of one of the oldest buildings on Main Street, a two-story structure of weathered cedar shingles and large front windows that looked out onto the sidewalk where, even now, the morning mist was beginning to thin, revealing glimpses of the street beyond, the old lamp-posts with their gentle globes, the flower boxes that Mrs. Yamamoto tended with such care outside her tea shop next door, the distant suggestion of the harbor where fishing boats would soon be heading out for the day's catch. Daniel had come to Seabrook Haven 8 years ago, after everything had fallen apart, after the letter from the lawyer had arrived telling him that he had been written out of his adoptive father's will entirely, that the man who had raised him since he was 3 years old, who had brought him into the Prescott family and given him a home and a name and what Daniel had believed was love, had chosen in the end to leave him nothing, not a single photograph, not a piece of furniture, not even a mention in the document that would divide up a lifetime of accumulated wealth and memory. The Prescotts had been one of the founding families of Cascade Ridge, a prosperous town 3 hours inland from here, built on the lumber business that Daniel's adoptive grandfather had started in the 1920s, and that had grown, decade by decade, into a small empire of sawmills and timberland and real estate holdings that spread across 3 counties. Daniel had grown up in the Prescott House, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the hill above town, had run through its hallways as a child, had learned to read in its library, had blown out birthday candles in its dining room while his adoptive parents smiled and his older brother Marcus watched with that complicated expression that Daniel had never quite understood. Not then, not later, not even now. But he did not want to think about Marcus this morning. He did not want to think about the will, about the lawyer's carefully neutral voice reading the document that had erased Daniel from the family history as completely as if he had never existed at all. He did not want to think about the way his adoptive mother, Catherine, had looked at him across the conference table, her eyes red from crying, but her jaw set firm, her silence saying everything her words did not. He did not want to think about any of it, not on this soft October morning when the mist was lifting and the tea was warm in his hands and the bookshop below was waiting to be opened, waiting to welcome whatever lonely readers might wander in, seeking comfort among the shelves. Daniel finished his tea slowly, savoring each sip, then carried the cup to the small kitchen and washed it carefully by hand, as he always did, drying it with a soft cloth and placing it back on the shelf beside the window where the morning light would find it. This small ritual, this daily honoring of the mother he had never known, had become as essential to him as breathing, a way of acknowledging that he came from somewhere, that he belonged to someone, even if that someone had died when he was barely old enough to remember her face. He dressed simply, as he always did, in soft cotton and worn wool, colors that echoed the earth and sea around him, browns and grays and the deep blue-green of the Pacific at twilight. He pulled on his cardigan, the one with the patches at the elbows that he had sewn himself, and he slipped his feet into comfortable shoes that had molded themselves to his steps over years of wearing, and he made his way down the narrow staircase that connected his apartment to the back room of the shop below. The bookshop smelled of old paper and cedar and the faint sweetness of the beeswax candles that Daniel lit each morning, a scent that he had come to associate with home, with safety, with the quiet contentment of being exactly where he was meant to be. The shelves rose to the ceiling, filled with volumes arranged not by the rigid categories of larger stores, but by a system that made sense only to Daniel and to the regular customers who had learned to trust his recommendations, who had discovered that if you told Daniel what you were feeling, what you were seeking, what ache in your heart needed soothing, he would disappear into the stacks and return with exactly the book you needed, even if you hadn't known you needed it at all. He moved through the shop slowly, lighting candles, adjusting books that had shifted overnight, as though restless in their sleep, running his fingers along spines that had become as familiar to him as old friends. The morning light was growing stronger now, filtering through the large front windows in pale golden beams that caught the dust motes drifting lazily through the air, and Daniel felt that familiar settling feeling, that sense of rightness that came with the start of each day in this place he had made his own. At 9 o'clock precisely, he unlocked the front door and turned the hand-painted sign from closed to open, then stepped outside onto the sidewalk to breathe the cool morning air and watch the town come slowly to life around him. Mrs. Yamamoto was already at work in her tea shop, and she waved to him through her window with the warm smile that always made him feel welcomed, always made him feel seen. Across the street, old Mr. Kowalski was opening the shutters of his antique store, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that there was no reason to rush, that the day would unfold at its own pace, regardless of how quickly one moved through it. Seabrook Haven was that kind of town, a place where time seemed to move differently, more gently, as though the constant presence of the ocean had taught its residents something about patience, about the eternal rhythm of tides and seasons, about the way that everything eventually comes and goes and comes again. The town had been a fishing village once, then a logging outpost, then a quiet backwater that the 20th century had mostly forgotten, and now it was becoming something new, a refuge for artists and writers and people seeking a simpler life. People like Daniel who had come here wounded and had found in its misty streets and weathered buildings a place where wounds could heal, where the past could be set aside, where one could begin again. Daniel had not planned to stay when he first arrived, driving his old truck down the coastal highway with everything he owned packed into the bed, fleeing the aftermath of his adoptive father's death and the revelation of the will and the terrible silence that had fallen between him and everyone he had once called family. He had stopped in Seabrook Haven only because he was tired, because the fog had rolled in so thick that he could barely see the road ahead, because there was a motel at the edge of town with a vacancy sign glowing soft and pink through the mist. He had planned to sleep one night and continue on, heading south toward he knew not what. Just away, just somewhere else, somewhere the name Prescott meant nothing, somewhere he could figure out who he was if he wasn't Daniel Prescott, if he wasn't the adopted son of one of Cascade Ridge's most prominent families, if he wasn't anything at all. But he had woken the next morning to sunlight streaming through the motel window and the sound of seabirds crying and something that felt almost like hope stirring in his chest for the first time in months. He had walked into town for breakfast and found the building on Main Street, empty and for sale, with its large front windows and its weathered cedar shingles and its apartment upstairs that seemed to be waiting for someone, waiting for him. He had used the small inheritance from his birth mother's family, money that had come to him when he turned 21 and that he had kept in a savings account all those years, never touching it, never knowing what it was for, only knowing that it was hers, that it connected him to her, that it was the only thing he had that the Prescotts had not given him and therefore could not take away. And so he had stayed, and he had built this life, this quiet life of books and tea and misty mornings, This life that asked nothing of him except that he be kind to the people who wandered into his shop seeking stories, seeking escape, seeking the particular comfort that can only be found between the pages of a well-loved book. The morning passed as mornings always did, in the gentle rhythm of small tasks and quiet conversations. A young mother came in looking for picture books for her daughter, and Daniel led her to the children's section in the back corner where the books were arranged by feeling rather than age, where stories about bravery sat beside stories about kindness, where tales of adventure mingled with tales of comfort. And she left with an armful of volumes and a smile of genuine gratitude. An elderly man Daniel had never seen before spent an hour browsing the philosophy section, running his weathered fingers along the spines with the reverent attention of someone who understood that books were sacred things, containers for human thought and feeling, vessels for everything that mattered most, and he bought a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius and thanked Daniel in a voice thick with emotion. Around noon, when the sun had finally burned away the last of the morning mist and the sky had turned the bright blue of polished glass, the bell above the door chimed, and Daniel looked up from the book he was cataloging to see a woman he did not recognize stepping into the shop. She was elderly, perhaps 80 or more, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that suggested a life fully lived, a strength earned through years of meeting whatever the world offered with grace and determination. Her hair was silver white, pulled back in a simple bun, and her face was lined with the beautiful complexity of age, the kind of face that told stories without speaking, that held decades of joy and sorrow and wisdom in every crease and curve. She wore a simple dress and soft gray, practical shoes, a cardigan in deep burgundy that looked hand-knitted, and she carried a canvas bag over one shoulder that bulged with what appeared to be papers, documents, the accumulated weight of something important. She paused just inside the doorway, her dark eyes taking in the shop with an expression that Daniel could not quite read, something between recognition and wonder, as though she were seeing something she had long imagined but never quite believed was real. "Mr. Chen," she said, and her voice was soft but steady, accented with something that spoke of distant shores, of journeys taken long ago. "Daniel Chen, I have been looking for you for a very long time." Daniel felt his heart give a strange little skip, a flutter of something that was not quite fear, not quite hope, but something in between, something that had been sleeping inside him for years and was now suddenly beginning to stir. He set down the book he had been holding and moved around the counter toward her, his movements careful, unhurried, matching the gentle pace that seemed to define this moment, this unexpected arrival. "I'm sorry," he said. "Do I know you?" The woman smiled then, a smile that seemed to hold both sadness and warmth, both memory and hope, and she shook her head slowly, the silver of her hair catching the afternoon light that streamed through the windows. "No," she said, "we have never met, but I knew your mother, Daniel. I knew Mei Lin. I was her friend many years ago before you were born, before so many things changed. My name is Eleanor Huang, and I have something I need to tell you, something I should have told you long ago, something that may change everything you believe about who you are and where you come from and what was left for you by the people who loved you most." Daniel felt the world shift beneath his feet, felt the solid ground of his carefully constructed life begin to tremble with the possibility of something new, something unexpected, something that had been waiting all these years in the wings of his story, hidden in plain sight, ready at last to reveal itself. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the worn leather armchairs by the window where the afternoon light fell soft and golden. "Please, sit down. I'll make tea, and then perhaps you could start from the beginning." Eleanor Huang settled into the armchair with the careful grace of someone who had learned to move thoughtfully through the world, every gesture considered, every movement made with attention. She placed her canvas bag on the small table between the chairs and folded her hands in her lap, her dark eyes following Daniel as he moved to the small electric kettle he kept behind the counter, watching him with an intensity that was not intrusive but rather deeply attentive, as though she were committing every detail of this moment to memory, as though she had waited so long for this meeting that she wanted to remember every part of it. Daniel prepared the tea in silence, his hands moving through the familiar ritual with a steadiness that surprised him, given the way his heart was racing, the way his mind was spinning with questions that tumbled over each other like leaves in an autumn wind. He selected oolong, loose leaf, from the small collection he kept for special occasions, and he warmed the pot with hot water before steeping the leaves, counting the seconds under his breath as his mother had taught him, or rather, as he imagined his mother might have taught him, since all he knew of her tea-making had come from books and from the single photograph he had of her, a black-and-white image of a young woman with gentle eyes holding a teacup in both hands, steam rising before her face like a veil. When the tea was ready, he poured 2 cups and carried them to the chairs by the window, handing one to Eleanor and settling into the opposite chair with his own cup cradled in his palms. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon light fell through the windows in soft golden bars, illuminating the dust motes that drifted through the air like tiny stars, and from somewhere outside came the distant cry of seabirds and the gentle sound of wind moving through the cedar trees that lined the street. "Tell me about her," Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me about my mother." Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, and when she looked at Daniel again, her eyes were bright with the gleam of memories long held, stories long kept, truths long waiting to be spoken. "Mei Lin was the kindest person I have ever known," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby meant to soothe rather than excite. "We met in San Francisco in 1984 when we were both young women newly arrived in this country, both seeking something better, both carrying dreams that felt too big for our small hands, but which we held on to anyway because what else can you do with a dream except hold it close and hope?" She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the misty street beyond where the afternoon was beginning to soften toward evening. "I was working at the Maritime Museum then, cataloging old ship records, immigration documents, the paper trail of all the souls who had crossed the Pacific seeking new lives. And Mei Lin, she worked at a small restaurant in Chinatown, a noodle shop run by her uncle, and every day on her lunch break she would walk down to the waterfront and sit on the same bench and look out at the bay with the most beautiful, far-away expression, as though she were seeing something beyond the water, something the rest of us couldn't see." Daniel listened, his tea growing cool in his hands, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, as though any disruption might break the spell of Eleanor's words and scatter the fragments of his mother's story before he could gather them all. "We became friends," Eleanor continued. "She was shy at first, your mother, careful with her words, careful with her trust, but once she let you in, once she decided you were worth knowing, she was the most loyal, the most generous, the most genuinely good person you could ever hope to meet. She had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, like whatever you were saying was the most important thing anyone had ever said, and she had this laugh, this quiet little laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, and when you heard it, you couldn't help but smile, couldn't help but feel that maybe the world wasn't such a hard place after all." "What happened to her?" Daniel asked, though he knew the answer, had always known the answer in the vague, unsatisfying way that orphans know the facts of their origins. How did I end up?" Eleanor's face softened with compassion, with the kind of gentle sorrow that comes from knowing how much a truth can hurt, even as it heals. "She got sick," Eleanor said simply. "When you were 2 years old. It came on slowly at first, a tiredness she couldn't shake, a cough that wouldn't go away. By the time the doctors figured out what it was, there wasn't much they could do. She had perhaps a year, they told her. A year to get her affairs in order, a year to figure out what would happen to you." Daniel felt his throat tighten, felt the familiar ache that always came when he thought about the mother he had barely known, the ghost of a woman whose love he had been too young to remember, but whose absence had shaped his entire life. "She was terrified," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping lower, softer, as though she were sharing a secret. "Not of dying, not really. Mei Lin had made her peace with that, had found some kind of acceptance that most of us never manage. No, she was terrified of leaving you alone in the world, of not being able to protect you, of not being able to give you all the things she had dreamed of giving you when she first held you in her arms and looked into your eyes and saw all the possibility there, all the potential, all the love she wanted to pour into your life." Eleanor reached for her canvas bag and began to withdraw papers, documents, photographs, the accumulated evidence of a story Daniel had never known. "Your mother had come to this country with nothing," she said, spreading the papers on the table between them. But she was clever, and she was determined, and over the years she had managed to save a little money to build a small life for herself and for you. And when she knew she was dying, she became almost obsessed with finding a way to protect that life, to protect you, to leave you something that would keep you safe no matter what happened. She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping and handed it to Daniel. It was from the Cascade Ridge Gazette, dated 1987, and it showed a photograph of a lighthouse. A beautiful old structure perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, its white tower gleaming against a stormy sky. Anchor Point Lighthouse, Eleanor said. Your mother bought it. Or rather, she arranged to have it bought, held in trust for you. Daniel stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to process what Eleanor was telling him. My mother bought a lighthouse? How? She worked in a noodle shop. You said she had nothing. Eleanor smiled, that sad, knowing smile that seemed to hold so many secrets. She didn't have money, Eleanor said, but she had something else, something far more valuable. She had information, she had documents, and she had a friend, a young lawyer she had met through the restaurant, a man named Joseph Winters who believed in her, who wanted to help her, who saw something in her that most people never noticed. She pulled out another document, this one older, more fragile, a legal paper covered in dense text and official stamps. This is the deed, she said. The Anchor Point Lighthouse, purchased in 1986 by the Mei Lin Chen Memorial Trust, to be held for the benefit of her son, Daniel Chen, until such time as he should reach the age of 35 or until such time as certain conditions should be met. I turned 35 in 3 months, Daniel said, his voice strange in his own ears, distant, dreamlike. Yes, Eleanor said, you do. Which is why I'm here. Which is why I've been looking for you. Because there's more to this story, Daniel. Much more. The lighthouse isn't just a building. It's a key to something your mother hid there, something she protected with her dying breath, something that has been waiting all these years for you to find it. The afternoon light was fading now, the golden bars retreating across the floor as the sun sank lower over the Pacific. Daniel sat in the gathering dusk, holding the photograph of the lighthouse, feeling the weight of his mother's love reaching across the years, across the void of death, still trying to protect him, still trying to guide him, still holding him close even though she had been gone for more than 30 years. What did she hide there? He asked. What's in the lighthouse? Eleanor's expression grew complicated, layered with emotions that Daniel couldn't quite read. The truth, she said, the truth about who you are, the truth about who your father was, and the truth about why the Prescott family adopted you, why they raised you as their own, and why, in the end, they wrote you out of the will as though you had never existed at all. She reached across the table and took Daniel's hand, her fingers warm and dry, her touch gentle but firm. Your mother loved you more than life itself, she said, and she knew, somehow, that you would face hardship, that you would be hurt, that there would come a time when you would need more than a lighthouse to hold on to. So she left you something else, something hidden in plain sight, something that has been waiting all these years for you to claim it. But first, you need to go to Anchor Point. You need to see the lighthouse for yourself. And you need to be prepared for what you might find there. Daniel looked at the photograph in his hands, at the white tower rising against the stormy sky, and he felt something shift inside him, something opening, like a door that had been closed for so long he had forgotten it was there. Where is it? He asked. The lighthouse. Where is Anchor Point? Eleanor squeezed his hand once, then released it and began to gather the papers back into her bag. That's the part of the story that requires some courage to hear, she said. Anchor Point is 30 miles north of Cascade Ridge. It sits on land that once belonged to the Prescott family, land that your mother somehow managed to purchase out from under them, land that has been held in trust for you all these years, waiting for you to claim it. Daniel felt the world tilt again, felt the foundations of everything he thought he knew begin to crack and shift. The Prescotts don't know? They know the lighthouse was sold. They know the land was lost, but they never knew who bought it, never knew the name of the trust, never knew that the child they would adopt just 1 year later was the rightful owner of one of the most contested pieces of property in their family's history. She stood, slinging the canvas bag over her shoulder, and looked down at Daniel with eyes that held decades of secrets, decades of waiting, decades of faith that this moment would eventually come. I'll leave you with these documents, she said, placing a thick envelope on the table. Read them, Think about what I've told you, and when you're ready, come find me at the Maritime Museum in Cascade Ridge. I have more to show you there, more pieces of your mother's puzzle, more answers to questions you didn't know you had. She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to look at Daniel one last time. Your mother asked me to watch over you, she said. All those years ago, when she knew she was dying, she made me promise to keep track of you, to make sure you were safe, to wait for the right moment to tell you the truth. I've watched you from afar, Daniel. I've seen you suffer, seen you struggle, seen you build this beautiful life from the ashes of what the Prescotts tried to take from you, and I want you to know that she would be so proud of you. Mei Lin would be so proud of the man you've become. And then she was gone, the bell above the door chiming softly as she stepped out into the fading afternoon, leaving Daniel alone with a photograph of a lighthouse and an envelope full of secrets and the strange, bittersweet feeling that his mother's love had been watching over him all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for him to see it. That night, Daniel did not sleep. He sat in his worn leather armchair as the darkness gathered around him, the envelope from Eleanor resting unopened in his lap, the photograph of the lighthouse propped against the lamp on the table beside him. The candles he had lit hours ago had burned down to pools of melted wax, their flames guttering and flickering as they reached the ends of their wicks, casting dancing shadows across the walls of books that surrounded him like the embracing arms of old friends. He knew he should open the envelope. He knew that the answers he had been seeking his entire life, the answers about who he was and where he came from and why the people who raised him had ultimately rejected him, were waiting just inside that seal of faded paper. But something held him back, some mixture of fear and reverence and the strange feeling that once he read what was inside, nothing would ever be the same, that the careful life he had constructed here in Seabrook Haven would be transformed in ways he could not predict or control. Outside the window, the ocean was a presence more felt than seen, its eternal rhythm reaching him through the darkness like a heartbeat, like the breath of something vast and patient that had been waiting for him to listen. The fog had returned with nightfall, wrapping the town in its soft embrace, muffling the sounds of the world until everything seemed suspended, dreamlike, as though he had stepped out of ordinary time into some liminal space where past and present and future all existed simultaneously, all held in the gentle grip of mist and memory. He thought about his mother, as he often did in the quiet hours of the night. He thought about the photograph he kept beside his bed, the only image he had of her, that young woman with gentle eyes holding a teacup in both hands. He tried to imagine her face in motion, tried to hear her voice speaking the words Eleanor had described, the words of a mother who loved her son so fiercely that she spent her dying days building a fortress of protection around him, a lighthouse of love that had been waiting all these years for him to find. And he thought about the Prescotts, about the family that had taken him in when he was 3 years old, had given him their name and their home and what he had believed for so many years was their love. He thought about his adoptive father, Howard Prescott, a towering man with silver hair and a booming laugh who had carried Daniel on his shoulders through the lumber yards, who had taught him to fish in the cold mountain streams, who had sat beside his bed when he was sick and read him stories in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. He thought about Catherine, his adoptive mother, a quiet woman with sad eyes who had always seemed to be carrying some weight Daniel could never identify, some sorrow she never spoke of, but which hung in the air around her like perfume, like mist, like the memory of something lost. And he thought about Marcus, his adoptive brother, 2 years older and 1,000 miles away, even when they were in the same room. Marcus, who had never seemed to want a brother, who had watched Daniel's arrival into the family with those complicated, unreadable eyes, who had grown more distant with each passing year until, by the time they were teenagers, they barely spoke at all. Marcus, who had inherited everything when Howard died, who had become the head of the Prescott family and the controller of the Prescott fortune, who had presumably been the one to ensure that Daniel's name was struck from the will, erased from the family history, cast out like something that had never belonged there in the first place. Daniel had not spoken to Marcus in 8 years, had not spoken to any of them, not since that terrible day in the lawyer's office when the will was read, and Daniel sat in stunned silence as he learned that the father he had loved, the father who had carried him on his shoulders and taught him to fish and read him stories, had left him nothing at all. Catherine had cried, he remembered that. She had cried and reached for his hand across the table, but when he looked at her, when he searched her face for some explanation, some comfort, she had looked away, had withdrawn her hand, had wrapped her arms around herself as though she were cold, as though the room had suddenly become a place she could not bear to be. And Marcus had not cried. Marcus had sat at the head of the table with the stillness of a man who had expected exactly this outcome, who had perhaps even engineered it. And when Daniel caught his eye, Marcus had simply nodded once, a small, tight movement of his head that seemed to say, "This is how it should be. This is how it was always going to be. You were never really one of us." Daniel had left that day and never gone back, had driven south in his old truck with nothing but his clothes and his books and his mother's teacup, the only thing in his possession that the Prescotts had not given him and therefore could not take away. He had driven for hours through rain that seemed like tears, through mountains that seemed like walls, through a landscape that blurred, and shifted behind the water streaming down his windshield until he reached the coast, reached the edge of the continent, reached the place where there was nowhere left to run. And he had stopped. And he had stayed, and he had built a life. But now, sitting in the darkness with the envelope in his lap and the photograph of the lighthouse catching the last flicker of candlelight, Daniel felt all of that careful construction beginning to tremble. The foundation he had laid over 8 years of quiet healing was being tested by something much older, much deeper, something that had been buried in the earth beneath his feet all along, just waiting for the right moment to rise. He picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of the documents inside, the weight of his mother's secrets, the weight of truth that had been waiting 30 years to be revealed. And then, slowly, carefully, like a man unwrapping a gift he was not sure he deserved, he broke the seal and began to read. The documents told a story that Daniel had never imagined, a story that reached back through decades to a time before he was born, to a complicated web of love and loss and the strange, circuitous ways that fate sometimes weaves the threads of human lives together. His mother, Mei Lin Chen, had come to America in 1982, a young woman of 21 with nothing but a small suitcase and a heart full of dreams. She had arrived in San Francisco on a cargo ship, traveling in the belly of the vessel with dozens of other hopeful souls, each of them seeking the promise of a new beginning in a land they had only heard about in stories. She had worked her way across the Pacific, cooking and cleaning for the crew, saving every penny, learning English from a kind sailor who had taken pity on her and spent his off hours teaching her words and phrases while the endless ocean rolled beneath them. In San Francisco, she had found work in her uncle's noodle shop, a small establishment in the heart of Chinatown where she spent her days rolling dough and chopping vegetables and serving customers who came from all walks of life, from the businessmen in suits who grabbed quick lunches to the artists and writers who lingered for hours over bowls of soup, scribbling in notebooks and talking about dreams. It was there, in that small restaurant with its steaming pots and cramped kitchen and the constant chatter of a dozen languages mixing in the air, that Mei Lin had met the man who would change her life. His name was Robert Holloway, and he was a young lawyer from a wealthy family in Northern California, a family with interests in timber and real estate and all the complicated machinery of American commerce. He had come to San Francisco to work at his family's law firm, but he had wandered into the noodle shop one rainy afternoon looking for something warm, and had found instead a young woman with gentle eyes who made him feel, for the first time in his privileged life, that the things he had been taught to value might not matter as much as he had believed. They fell in love slowly, carefully, the way that mismatched things sometimes find their way together, like two pieces of a puzzle that shouldn't fit, but somehow do. Robert kept coming back to the restaurant, day after day, week after week, and Maylene found herself looking forward to his visits, found herself saving the best table for him, found herself staying late after her shift to walk with him along the waterfront, watching the fog roll in from the bay while he told her about his world and she told him about hers. But Robert's world was not kind to love stories like theirs. His family, the Holloways, were people of old money and old prejudices, people who had built their fortune on the backs of workers they barely saw as human, people who believed that blood mattered more than anything, that marriage was about preserving lineages and combining assets, not about the ridiculous, inconvenient thing called love. When Robert told his father about Mei Lin, the elder Holloway gave his son an ultimatum: end the relationship immediately or be cut off from the family entirely, stripped of his name and his inheritance and everything that had ever been promised to him. And Robert, who had never been brave, who had never been strong, who had spent his entire life doing what his family expected of him, made the choice that haunted him for the rest of his days. He told Mei Lin that it was over. He told her that he had been foolish, that what they had was impossible, that she should forget him and find someone else, someone who could give her the life she deserved. And then he walked away, walked back into the gilded cage of his family's expectations, and never saw her again. But Mei Lin was already carrying his child. She had known for a few weeks before that final conversation, had been waiting for the right moment to tell him, and when he left her standing on the waterfront with the fog closing in around her, she had pressed her hand against her belly and made herself a promise. She would protect this child no matter what, would give this child everything she had, would love this child enough to make up for all the love that had been stolen from them both. Daniel set down the papers, his hands trembling slightly, his mind racing to make sense of what he was reading. His father was not some unknown figure, some mysterious absence in his history. His father was Robert Holloway, a lawyer from a wealthy family, a man who had chosen money and position over love, who had abandoned Mei Lin and never even known about the child she carried. But there was more, so much more. The next document was a legal agreement dated 1985, and it took Daniel several readings to understand what he was seeing. It appeared that Mei Lin had tracked down Robert's family, had somehow obtained information about their business dealings, had discovered something that gave her leverage, something that made them willing to negotiate rather than simply ignore the inconvenient woman from Chinatown who claimed to have borne their son's child. The Holloways, it turned out, had not built their empire entirely through honest means. They had, over the years, accumulated their wealth through a series of questionable land deals, through pressure and manipulation and sometimes outright fraud, particularly in their dealings with immigrant communities who didn't understand the American legal system and couldn't afford to fight back. And Mei Lin, working at the Maritime Museum with Eleanor, cataloging old ship records and immigration documents, had stumbled upon evidence of some of their worst offenses, evidence that could ruin them if it ever came to light. She had not wanted to destroy them. She had not wanted revenge. All she wanted, the documents made clear, was security for her son, a guarantee that Daniel would be protected and provided for regardless of what happened to her. And so she had negotiated quietly, carefully, with the help of a young lawyer named Joseph Winters, who believed in justice and who was willing to stand beside her as she faced down one of the most powerful families in Northern California. The agreement she reached was complicated but elegant. The Holloways would transfer ownership of a parcel of land they had acquired through questionable means, a piece of property called Anchor Point that included an old lighthouse on the coast north of a town called Cascade Ridge. The land would be placed in a trust for Daniel, held until he reached 35, at which point it would become fully his. In return, Mei Lin would keep the evidence she had gathered locked away, never to be revealed unless the Holloways or their associates attempted to harm her or her son in any way. But the agreement went further. The Holloways had business partners, other families who had benefited from their schemes, and chief among them were the Prescotts of Cascade Ridge, a lumber dynasty that had worked hand in hand with the Holloways for generations. And when Mei Lin became ill, when she realized she was dying and that Daniel would need a family to care for him, she reached out to the Prescotts with a proposition. They would adopt Daniel. They would raise him as their own, give him their name, provide him with all the advantages of their wealth and position. And in return, Mei Lin would ensure that the evidence she held against the Holloways, evidence that implicated the Prescotts as well, would remain safely locked away, protected by the terms of the trust that held the lighthouse. It was protection, Daniel realized. His mother had essentially created a hostage situation, a delicate balance of mutual assured destruction that would keep Daniel safe as long as everyone played by the rules. The Prescotts would raise him and treat him well because if anything happened to him, if he was harmed or mistreated or abandoned, the evidence would be released and their empire would crumble. But something had gone wrong. Somewhere along the way, the balance had tipped, the protection had failed, and Daniel had been written out of the will, cast out of the family, left with nothing despite all his mother's careful planning. The final document in the envelope was a letter, handwritten in a script that Daniel recognized from the single birthday card he had received from his mother before she died, a card he had kept all these years folded in the pages of his favorite book. "My dearest Daniel," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then Eleanor has found you, and the time has come for you to learn the truth about who you are and what I have tried to leave for you. I know this must be confusing and painful, and I am sorry that I cannot be there to explain it to you myself, to hold you and comfort you and answer all the questions I know you must have. But I want you to understand something, my sweet boy. I did not do any of this for revenge. I did not do it for money or power or any of the things that seem to matter so much in this world. I did it for love. I did it because I loved you from the moment I knew you were growing inside me. Loved you with a fierceness that frightened me sometimes. Loved you enough to move mountains and shake foundations and do whatever it took to keep you safe. The lighthouse is yours. It has always been yours, waiting for you, watching over the coast like I have watched over you in spirit all these years. Inside the lighthouse, in a room that can only be accessed by someone who knows where to look, I have hidden the original documents, the evidence that protects you, the truth about the Holloways and the Prescotts and all the tangled history that led to your existence. As long as those documents remain safe, as long as you hold the key to them, you have power over the people who might wish to harm you. But more than that, my darling, more than the protection and the leverage and all the complicated legal machinery I have put in place, I want you to have something else. I want you to have peace. I want you to have happiness. I want you to know that you were loved, are loved, will always be loved, by a mother who would have given anything to watch you grow, to see the man you would become, to hold you one more time and tell you how proud I am of you. Go to the lighthouse, Daniel. Go and see what I have left for you, and when you stand at the top, looking out over the ocean that separates us, know that I am there with you, in the wind and the waves and the light that guides sailors home. Know that my love for you is the lighthouse, the beacon, the constant flame that will never go out. Your mother, Maylene Daniel, held the letter for a long time after he finished reading, held it as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows of the bookshop, held it as the world outside slowly emerged from the darkness, soft and gray and new. His cheeks were wet with tears he didn't remember crying, and his heart felt both heavier and lighter than it had in years, weighted with grief and loss, but also lifted by something he had never quite felt before, something like hope, like belonging, like finally understanding where he came from and why. His mother had loved him, had fought for him, had built a fortress of protection around him that had lasted 30 years, that had watched over him even when he didn't know it was there, that had been hiding in plain sight all along, a lighthouse on a cliff overlooking the ocean, waiting for him to come home. The drive north along the coastal highway was a meditation, a slow unwinding of road and rock and the endless expanse of the Pacific stretching toward the horizon like a promise of something vast and unknown. Daniel had closed the bookshop for the first time since he'd opened it, had taped a handwritten note to the door that said simply, "Family Emergency, back soon," and had set out in his old truck just as the morning fog began to lift, the world revealing itself in layers of gray and green and the silver shimmer of wet pavement. The highway hugged the coastline, curving around cliffs and cutting through forests of redwood and cedar that rose on the inland side like cathedral walls, their ancient trunks draped in moss and fern and the soft filtered light that made this part of the world feel timeless, enchanted, as though he were driving through a dream rather than a landscape. Every few miles, he would catch a glimpse of the ocean through a break in the trees, its surface shifting from gray to green to the dark blue of deep water, and each glimpse filled him with a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension, as though he were approaching something that would change everything, something that could not be undone. He had called Eleanor that morning, had used the number she'd left for him written on the back of the Maritime Museum business card, and she had answered on the second ring as though she had been waiting, as though she had known he would call. She had given him directions to the lighthouse, detailed instructions that involved turning off the main highway onto a narrow road that wound through the hills, then following a series of markers that only someone who knew what to look for would recognize. The lighthouse keeper's cottage is still standing, she had told him. The trust has maintained it all these years, paid for a caretaker to check on it each month, kept the windows clean and the roof patched and the garden from going entirely wild. Your mother wanted it to be ready for you when you finally came. And so Daniel drove, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind moving through everything he had learned, trying to assemble the pieces into a picture that made sense. His father was Robert Holloway, a wealthy man's son who had lacked the courage to stand by the woman he loved. His mother had been a fighter, a strategist, a woman who had turned her own powerlessness into a weapon that protected her child for decades after her death. The Prescotts had adopted him not out of love, not out of kindness, but out of necessity, to fulfill a bargain they had made with a dying woman who held their darkest secrets in her hands. But if that was true, then why had they written him out of the will? Why had they abandoned the agreement that was supposed to protect him? What had changed? The questions tumbled through his mind as the miles fell away behind him, as the landscape grew wilder and more remote, as the towns became smaller and farther between, until finally there was nothing but forest and cliff and sea. He turned off the highway where Eleanor had instructed, onto a road so narrow that branches scraped against the sides of his truck, and he followed it through the hills until he reached a rusted gate with a faded sign that read Anchor Point, Private Property. The gate was unlocked, as Eleanor had promised it would be, and Daniel drove through, his heart beating faster now, his whole body alert with the sense of approaching something momentous. The road beyond the gate was unpaved, rutted with age and weather, and he had to navigate carefully, picking his way around puddles and fallen branches until at last the trees fell away, and he emerged onto a headland, a finger of rock and grass pointing out into the Pacific, and there, at its tip, stood the lighthouse. It was more beautiful than the photograph had suggested, more beautiful than anything Daniel had imagined. The tower was white, perhaps 50 feet tall, its paint weathered but still bright against the gray sky, and at its top was the light room, the glass panels reflecting the afternoon light in fractured rainbows. Beside the tower stood the keeper's cottage, a small stone building with a slate roof and windows that looked out over the ocean, and surrounding both structures was a garden that had once been formal but had grown wild over the years. Roses and lavender and coastal grasses tangled together in a fragrant chaos that seemed somehow perfect, somehow right. Daniel parked the truck and sat for a moment, just looking. The wind was stronger here on the headland, carrying the salt smell of the sea and the distant cry of gulls, and the waves crashed against the rocks below with a rhythm that felt ancient, eternal, as though this place had been here forever and would remain long after everything else had crumbled to dust. He felt very small suddenly, very young, like a child approaching something too vast to comprehend, and he had to remind himself to breathe, to move, to step out of the truck and walk toward the building that his mother had bought for him 30 years ago. The front door of the cottage was painted blue, the color faded by decades of salt and sun, and when Daniel touched the handle, he felt a strange tingle run through his fingers, as though the building were recognizing him, welcoming him home. The key Eleanor had given him fit smoothly into the lock, and the door swung open without resistance, revealing an interior that was simple but warm, furnished with pieces that looked hand-picked for comfort rather than style. There was a fireplace with a worn rug before it, a bookshelf filled with volumes that seemed carefully selected, a kitchen with copper pots hanging from hooks, and a window that looked out over the garden. Everything was clean, well-maintained, cared for by unknown hands over unknown years, and Daniel moved through the rooms in a daze, touching surfaces, opening doors, trying to absorb the fact that this was his, that his mother had imagined him here, had wanted him to have this place where the land met the sea, where the light swept out over the dark waters, where a person could stand and feel like they were at the edge of the world. In the kitchen, he found a door that led to the lighthouse tower itself, and he climbed the spiral staircase slowly, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space, his hand trailing along the curved wall. The stairs wound up, around and around, until at last he emerged into the light room at the top, and the view that greeted him stole his breath entirely. The Pacific stretched before him in every direction, vast and gray and endless, and the sky above was a dome of clouds through which occasional rays of sunlight broke in golden beams, illuminating patches of water that glittered like scattered diamonds. He could see the coastline curving away to the north and south, could see the dark shapes of rocks jutting from the waves, could see the distant suggestion of mountains on the horizon where the sky met the sea in a line so faint it might have been imagined. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he stood there for a long time, just looking, just breathing, just letting the vastness wash over him until he felt emptied out and filled up again with something new. His mother had stood here, he realized. 30 years ago, before she died, she had climbed these stairs and looked out at this view and imagined her son standing in this exact spot someday, inheriting this piece of the world she had fought so hard to give him. The thought brought tears to his eyes, but they were not sad tears, not entirely. They were tears of gratitude, of connection, of finally understanding that the love he had always been searching for had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for him at the edge of the continent where the light met the darkness and showed ships the way home. He did not find the hidden documents that day. He did not try to find them. There would be time for that later, time to explore every corner of this place his mother had left him, time to uncover all the secrets she had buried and all the protection she had built. For now, it was enough to simply be here, to know that this existed, to understand that he had a home that no one could take from him, a place that had been waiting for him all his life. That night, Daniel slept in the keeper's cottage, in a bed that faced a window overlooking the sea. The sound of the waves was constant, rhythmic, like a lullaby sung by the ocean itself, and the beam of the lighthouse swept across the room at regular intervals, a gentle pulse of light that reminded him he was not alone, had never been alone, was watched over by a love that transcended death and time and all the complicated machinery of human affairs. And in his dreams, he saw his mother, young and beautiful, standing at the top of the lighthouse with her arms open wide, and she was smiling at him, telling him without words that everything was going to be all right, that she was proud of him, that he had finally found his way home. The days that followed unfolded with the gentle inevitability of waves washing onto shore, each one bringing new discoveries, new revelations, new pieces of the puzzle that Daniel was slowly learning to assemble. He divided his time between the lighthouse and Seabrook Haven, driving the coastal highway back and forth as though tracing a thread that connected the two parts of his life, the part he had built for himself and the part his mother had built for him. Eleanor became his guide through the labyrinth of the past. He met her at the Maritime Museum in Cascade Ridge, a beautiful old building on the waterfront that housed centuries of seafaring history. And she showed him the archives where she had worked all those years ago, where she and Mei Lin had first become friends, where the evidence that protected Daniel had originally been discovered. "Your mother had a gift for seeing patterns," Eleanor told him as they walked through the stacks of documents and ledgers. "She would spend hours in here, poring over old shipping records, immigration logs, land transfer documents, and she would notice things that no one else noticed, connections that no one else made. That's how she found the evidence against the Holloways. It was hidden in plain sight, scattered across dozens of different files, and anyone else would have missed it. But not Mei Lin. She saw it all, clear as day." The evidence, Eleanor explained, documented a decades-long scheme of land fraud perpetrated by the Holloway and Prescott families, starting in the early 1900s and continuing well into the 1980s. They had targeted immigrant communities along the coast, using their control of banks and lawyers and local government to manipulate property records, forge documents, and essentially steal land from people who didn't have the resources to fight back. The scale of the fraud was staggering, affecting hundreds of families over 3 generations, and the legal implications, if the evidence were ever made public, would be catastrophic. "Your mother knew that this information was dangerous," Eleanor said. "She knew that the Holloways and the Prescotts would do almost anything to keep it hidden. That's why she created such an elaborate system of protection. The evidence is stored in multiple locations with multiple safeguards, and the only way to access all of it is to have the key that she left for you at the lighthouse." The key, it turned out, was not a physical object, but a series of codes and locations that Mei Lin had encrypted and hidden throughout the lighthouse property. Daniel spent his days exploring the building and grounds, following clues that his mother had left like breadcrumbs through a forest, each one leading to another piece of the puzzle. He found the first clue carved into the wood of the lighthouse stairs, a series of numbers that corresponded to specific books in the cottage's library. Those books contained marked passages that, when read in order, spelled out the location of a metal box buried in the garden beneath a rose bush that Mei Lin had planted herself 30 years ago in the weeks before she died. The box contained documents, photographs, and a letter explaining the next step in the scavenger hunt she had designed. A hunt that seemed intended not just to protect the evidence, but to teach Daniel about his mother, about her life, about the love that had driven her to create such an intricate web of protection. Each discovery revealed new facets of Mei Lin Chen. Through the documents and letters, Daniel learned about her childhood in China, about the grandmother who had raised her after her parents died, about the dreams she had carried across the Pacific and the disappointments she had faced when the reality of America proved harsher than its promise. He learned about her relationship with Robert Holloway, about the way their love had bloomed and then been crushed by forces larger than either of them could fight, and he learned about the months after Robert left her, about the determination that had taken hold as she realized she was pregnant, about the transformation from heartbroken young woman into the fierce protector who would spend her dying days building a fortress around her child. She never stopped loving him, Eleanor told Daniel one afternoon as they sat in the Maritime Museum's small cafe drinking tea. "Robert, I mean. Even after everything he did, everything he failed to do, she still loved him, but she loved you more. That was the difference. When it came down to a choice between hoping Robert would change and protecting you, there was no contest. You were everything to her, Daniel. You were the reason she kept fighting, kept planning, kept building this incredible structure of protection that has lasted all these years. Daniel listened, absorbing the words, letting them settle into the spaces inside him that had been empty for so long. He was beginning to understand something that had always confused him about his own nature, about the gentleness that people always remarked upon, about the way he seemed to approach the world, with patience and kindness, even when it didn't seem warranted. He had thought it was weakness, sometimes, this tendency to see the good in people, to give second chances, to forgive. But now he wondered if it was something else entirely. Something inherited from a mother who had loved even when love was not returned, who had protected even when protection was not deserved, who had built bridges of compassion across chasms of betrayal. 2 weeks after his first visit to the lighthouse, Daniel completed his mother's scavenger hunt and found the final cache of documents hidden in a secret compartment in the lightroom itself, accessible only by pressing a sequence of panels in a specific order that corresponded to Daniel's birthday and the date of Maylin's arrival in America. The compartment contained everything: the original evidence of the Holloway-Prescott land fraud, copies of the agreements Maylin had negotiated, records of the trust that held the lighthouse, and one final letter, sealed in an envelope with Daniel's name written in his mother's familiar script. "My dearest Daniel," the letter began. "If you have found this, then you have proven yourself to be as patient and clever and determined as I always knew you would be. You have followed the path I laid for you, and now you hold in your hands the power to bring down the families who have wronged us, who have wronged so many people over so many years. But I want you to understand something, my son. I did not give you this power so that you could use it for revenge. Revenge is a poison that destroys the one who carries it far more than the one it is aimed at. I know this because I felt the temptation, in my darkest moments, to use this evidence to destroy Robert and his family, to watch them suffer as they had made me suffer. But that is not the person I wanted to be. That is not the person I wanted you to become. I gave you this power so that you could be free, so that you would never have to be afraid of the Holloways or the Prescotts or anyone else who might try to harm you. As long as you hold these documents, they cannot touch you without risking everything they have built. You are protected, my darling boy, not by walls or weapons, but by knowledge, by truth, by the simple fact that the secrets they have spent generations hiding are safe in your hands. Use this power wisely, Daniel. Use it to protect yourself, yes, but also consider using it to help the people who were harmed by their crimes, the families who lost their land, who lost their homes, who lost their heritage to the greed of men who thought they were above consequence. These people deserve justice, and you have the means to give it to them. But more than anything, my son, I want you to be happy. I want you to live a life full of love and kindness and the simple pleasures that make existence worthwhile. I want you to find someone to share your days with, to build a family if that is what you desire, to create the kind of warm, safe home that I always dreamed of giving you myself. The lighthouse is yours. The evidence is yours. The choice of what to do with both is yours alone. I trust you to make the right decision because you are my son, and I know the goodness that lives in your heart. With all my love, forever and always, your mother, Maylin Daniel, held the letter for a long time, sitting in the light room as the sun set over the Pacific and the beam began its nightly rotation, sweeping out across the dark waters in an endless rhythm of illumination and shadow. He thought about justice and revenge, about power and forgiveness, about all the complicated calculations that humans make when they have been wronged and must decide how to respond. And he thought about the Prescotts, about the family that had raised him and then cast him aside, about Marcus and Catherine and the ghost of Howard, whose absence still ached in Daniel's heart like an old wound that had never quite healed. They had wronged him, there was no question of that. They had taken him in under false pretenses, had raised him as a pawn in a game he hadn't known he was playing, had ultimately discarded him when the cost of keeping him became higher than the cost of letting him go. But they were also the only family he had ever known. They were the people who had taught him to read and to fish, who had celebrated his birthdays and nursed his childhood illnesses, who had given him, however imperfectly, a place in the world when he might otherwise have had none. And as Daniel sat in the lighthouse that his mother had bought for him with blackmail and determination and fierce maternal love, he found that he could not hate them, could not even fully blame them. They were flawed people caught in a flawed situation, their choices constrained by secrets and fear, and the terrible momentum of generations of wrongdoing that had begun long before any of them were born. What was he supposed to do with that? What was justice, in a situation where everyone was compromised, where everyone had reasons for what they did, where the line between victim and perpetrator was so tangled that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began? He didn't know the answer. Not yet. But as the lighthouse beam swept across the waters and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daniel felt something settling inside him, some resolution that was not quite forgiveness but was not quite revenge either. It was something softer, something more patient, something that his mother might have understood. He would wait, he would watch, he would keep the evidence safe and see what the future brought. And when the time came to act, he would act not from anger or fear, but from something better, something his mother had left him along with the lighthouse and the documents and the power they represented. He would act from love. The autumn deepened into winter, and Daniel settled into a new rhythm that incorporated both his bookshop in Seabrook Haven and his lighthouse at Anchor Point. He drove between them often, sometimes spending nights at the cottage when the need for solitude and the sound of the ocean became too strong to resist, other times returning to his apartment above the shop where the familiar smell of old books and beeswax candles reminded him of the life he had built with his own hands. Mrs. Yamamoto noticed the change in him first. "You seem different," she said one morning, pausing at the doorway of his shop with a container of the green tea she sometimes brought him from her own inventory. "Lighter somehow, like you've set down something you've been carrying for a long time." Daniel smiled, accepting the tea with gratitude. "I suppose I have," he said. "I've been learning about my mother, about who she was, what she did for me. It's complicated, but it helps, knowing, understanding." Mrs. Yamamoto nodded with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to know that family stories were rarely simple, that love and pain often walked hand in hand through the generations. "Knowing where we come from gives us strength," she said, "even when that knowledge is painful, especially then." The winter storms came, as they always did on this part of the coast, with winds that rattled windows and rain that fell in sheets so thick you could barely see across the street. Daniel kept the bookshop open through the worst of it, and the regulars came, grateful for a warm place to sit and a kind face to talk to while the world outside turned gray and wild. He recommended books, made tea, listened to stories of lives and losses and small triumphs, and he felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But underneath the peace of his daily life, something was stirring. The knowledge of what he possessed, the power he held over the families who had shaped his existence, created a kind of pressure that he could feel building slowly, like water behind a dam. He knew that eventually something would have to give, that the delicate equilibrium his mother had created could not last forever, that there would come a moment when he would have to choose what to do with the truth she had left in his hands. That moment came on a gray afternoon in late January, when the bell above the bookshop door chimed and Daniel looked up to see a face he had not expected to see ever again. Marcus Prescott stood in the doorway, rain dripping from the collar of his expensive coat, his face older and more tired than Daniel remembered it. Lines of stress etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of years of carrying burdens that weighed heavily on a man's soul. He looked around the shop with an expression that Daniel could not quite read, taking in the towers of books and the soft amber light, and the worn leather armchairs by the window. And when his eyes finally met Daniel's, there was something in them that might have been shame, or might have been sorrow, or might have been simply the weariness of someone who had traveled a very long way to say something he did not know how to say. "Daniel," Marcus said, and his voice was different too, softer, less certain than the commanding tone Daniel remembered from their childhood. I wasn't sure you would still be here. I've been looking for you for months. I almost gave up." Daniel felt his heart beating faster, felt the old wounds stirring beneath the scar tissue of 8 years of careful healing. But he also felt something else, something that his time at the lighthouse had given him, a kind of centeredness that allowed him to stand in this moment without being overwhelmed by it. "Marcus," he said simply, "it's been a long time. Too long." Marcus stepped further into the shop, letting the door swing closed behind him, and Daniel noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, that his usual air of confidence and control was nowhere to be found. "I need to talk to you. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you years ago, things that might help you understand, or at least things you deserve to know. Daniel gestured toward the armchairs by the window, the same chairs where Eleanor had sat that first afternoon, where so many customers had found comfort and conversation over the years. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make tea, and then you can tell me whatever you came here to say." He moved to the kettle, his movements calm and deliberate, and he felt Marcus watching him, felt the tension radiating from his adoptive brother like heat from a fire. The water boiled, the tea steeped, and Daniel carried 2 cups to the chairs by the window, handing one to Marcus and settling into the opposite seat with his own cup cradled in his hands. The rain continued to fall outside, streaking down the window in silver rivulets, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the years of distance and all the words that had never been said, and Daniel waited, patient as he had learned to be, letting Marcus find his own way to whatever it was he needed to say. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said finally, his voice low and rough, "for so many things, for the way I treated you when we were children, for the silence all these years, for the will." He set down his teacup and pressed his hands against his face for a moment, a gesture of exhaustion and regret. "Especially for the will." "You wrote me out of it," Daniel said, not accusingly, just stating a fact that needed to be acknowledged. "No." Marcus dropped his hands and met Daniel's eyes, and there was something like desperation in his gaze. "That's what I came to tell you. I didn't write you out. Neither did Father, not really. It was more complicated than that. It was always more complicated than you knew." And then Marcus began to talk, and the story he told was another thread in the tangled tapestry of Daniel's origins, another piece of the puzzle that had been hidden all these years, waiting to be revealed. Howard Prescott, it turned out, had genuinely loved Daniel, had loved him from the moment he first held the 3-year-old boy who had come to live in their house, had loved him through all the years of raising him, teaching him, watching him grow. But Howard had also been a man trapped in a web of his own family's making, bound by the same secrets and lies that had bound his father and grandfather before him, complicit in crimes he had not committed but had benefited from all his life. When Mei Lin had approached the Prescotts with her proposition, Howard had been the one to accept. He had seen in Daniel a chance at redemption, a way to make amends for at least some of the harm his family had caused. He had convinced Catherine to take in this child, had promised to raise him as his own, had meant every word of it, and for years the arrangement had worked. Daniel had grown up in the Prescott home, had been given every advantage, had been loved, genuinely loved, by a father who saw in him not a pawn or a hostage, but a son. But the Holloways had never accepted the situation. Robert Holloway, Daniel's biological father, had died 5 years after abandoning Mei Lin, killed in a car accident that some whispered was not entirely accidental. His father, the patriarch of the Holloway clan, had never forgiven the embarrassment of his son's relationship with a Chinese immigrant, had never accepted that his blood was flowing through the veins of a child he considered beneath him. And as the years passed and the old man's health declined, his obsession with erasing any evidence of his son's indiscretion had only grown stronger. "They threatened us," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "when Father was dying, when he was too sick to fight back anymore. The Holloways came to us and said that if Daniel was included in the will, if there was any public acknowledgement that he was part of our family, they would destroy us. They had evidence of their own, evidence of things our family had done, and they made it clear that they would use it if we didn't cooperate." "So you chose to abandon me," Daniel said, still without accusation, still trying to understand rather than condemn. "I chose to survive." Marcus's voice cracked on the word. "I was scared, Daniel. I was young and scared, and I didn't know what to do. Father was dying, Mother was falling apart, and the Holloways were threatening to take everything. I made a choice that I've regretted every day since, a choice that cost me the brother I should have protected instead of sacrificed." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, worn and creased as though it had been handled many times. "Father left you a letter," Marcus said. "He wrote it before he died, when he still had the strength to hold a pen. He gave it to me and made me, promised to give it to you someday, when the time was right, when it was safe. I've been carrying it with me for 8 years, trying to find the courage to find you, to face you, to tell you the truth." Daniel took the envelope with hands that were not quite steady. He recognized Howard Prescott's handwriting on the front. his name written in the careful script of a man who had once helped him with his homework, who had praised his accomplishments and comforted his failures, who had been, in all the ways that mattered, his father. "Read it," Marcus said. "Please. And then maybe you can tell me if there's any chance, any possibility, that you might someday be able to forgive me." Daniel opened the envelope and withdrew the letter inside, and as he began to read, the rain continued to fall outside the window, and somewhere in the distance a lighthouse beam swept across the gray waters of the Pacific, guiding lost ships toward home. "My dear son Daniel," the letter read, in Howard Prescott's careful, elegant script. "If you are reading this, then Marcus has finally found the courage to give you the truth, and I can rest easier knowing that you will understand, at last, what happened and why. I write this letter in the final weeks of my life, when the doctors have told me that my time is short and the shadows are gathering at the edges of my vision, and I find that facing death has made me braver than I ever was in life. I want you to know, first and foremost, that I loved you. From the moment you came into our home, a small, frightened boy with your mother's gentle eyes and a heart full of wonder, I loved you as completely and fiercely as any father has ever loved a son. You were not a burden to me, Daniel. You were not an obligation or a duty or a pawn in the complicated games our families played. You were a gift, a second chance, a reminder that even in the midst of darkness, there can be light. I know the story of how you came to us. Your mother, Mei Lin, told me everything before she died, trusted me with the truth because she had no choice, because she needed someone to understand what was at stake, what was being protected, what her son represented. She was one of the bravest people I have ever known, your mother. She faced down powers that would have crushed most people, negotiated with enemies that should have terrified her, built a fortress of protection around you that has lasted long after her death. I hope that someday you will learn her whole story, and that when you do, you will be as proud of her as I was. The Prescott family has done terrible things over the generations, Daniel, things I'm ashamed of, things I've spent my life trying to quietly atone for in whatever small ways I could. We built our fortune on exploitation and fraud, on taking what belonged to others and calling it our own, on systems of power that benefited us at the expense of countless people who had no way to fight back. I did not create these systems, but I benefited from them. I lived in the house they built, spent the money they earned, enjoyed the privileges they provided. That makes me complicit, even if I never personally committed the crimes. Your mother gave me a chance to do something different. By taking you in, by raising you as my own, I was able to feel, for the first time in my life, that I was doing something purely good, something untainted by the dark history of my family. You were my redemption, Daniel. Not because you owed me anything, not because I was saving you, but because loving you, watching you grow, being your father in all the ways that matter, showed me that I was capable of being better than the legacy I inherited. I am sorry that I could not protect you from the Holloways. I am sorry that in my final days, when I was too weak to fight, they forced our family to make a choice that betrayed everything I had tried to build. Marcus was young and frightened, and he did what he thought he had to do to survive. I do not blame him, and I hope that you will not blame him either. We are all, in the end, products of our circumstances, doing our best with the choices we are given. But I want you to know that my love for you was real. Every moment we spent together, every lesson I taught you, every conversation we shared, came from a place of genuine affection, not obligation. You were my son, Daniel. You will always be my son. And no will, no document, no legal arrangement can ever change that. I do not know what the future holds for you. I do not know if you will ever find out the truth about your mother, about the lighthouse she left you, about the power you hold over the families that have shaped your life. But I hope that if you do, you will use that power wisely. I hope that you will find a way to seek justice without being consumed by revenge, to right wrongs without creating new ones, to break the cycle of harm that has defined our families for so long. Most of all, I hope that you will be happy. I hope that you will find love, build a family of your own, create a life full of meaning and connection and all the simple pleasures that make existence worthwhile. You deserve that, Daniel. You deserve peace and joy and the knowledge that you are worthy of love exactly as you are. I am proud of you, son. I will always be proud of you. With all my love, your father, Howard Prescott. Daniel finished reading and sat in silence, the letter resting in his lap, the weight of it far heavier than mere paper could account for. Outside the window, the rain had begun to ease, the clouds thinning to reveal patches of pale gray sky, and Marcus sat across from him, waiting, his face a mask of tension and hope and fear. "He loved you," Marcus said. "He really did. I know it doesn't make up for what happened, what we let happen, but I wanted you to know. I wanted you to have that, at least." Daniel looked at the letter, at the words his father had written in his final days, at the love and regret and hope that flowed through every line, and he thought about his mother, about Maylene, who had built a fortress of protection around him with nothing but determination and courage and a fierce, uncompromising love. He thought about the lighthouse waiting for him on the headland, about the evidence hidden in its walls, about the power he held to bring down the families that had shaped his life. And he thought about forgiveness. "I don't know if I can forgive everything," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "There's so much history, so much pain, so many people who were hurt by things that happened long before either of us was born. But I can try to understand. I can try to see the people behind the choices, the fear and love and human weakness that led to everything that happened, and maybe that's where forgiveness starts. Not with forgetting, not with excusing, but with understanding." Marcus's eyes filled with tears, the first Daniel had ever seen him shed. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "More than I had any right to hope for." "Maybe." Daniel set down the letter and looked at his brother, really looked at him for the first time in 8 years, seeing not the privileged heir who had abandoned him, but a man carrying the weight of choices made in fear, a man who had driven through the rain to find him, to confess, to try somehow to make amends. "But it's what I have to offer, and perhaps in time it can become something more." They sat together in the bookshop as the afternoon faded toward evening, talking in a way they had never talked before, sharing stories of the years they had lost, uncovering the common ground that lay beneath all the distance and pain. Marcus spoke of the pressure of running the family business, the loneliness of wealth without connection, the guilt that had followed him like a shadow through every day since the will was read. Daniel spoke of his life in Seabrook Haven, of the bookshop and the lighthouse, of Eleanor and the truth about his mother that had finally set him free. And when Marcus finally left, stepping out into the evening air that smelled of rain and sea and the first hints of approaching spring, Daniel felt something shift inside him, some final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The wounds were not healed, not entirely. Perhaps they never would be, but they were no longer festering in the dark. They had been brought into the light, examined, understood, and that made all the difference. The spring came gently to Seabrook Haven, the fog lifting earlier each day, the garden outside Mrs. Yamamoto's tea shop bursting into bloom with flowers that seemed to glow in the soft morning light. Daniel spent more time at the lighthouse now, watching the seasons change from the top of the tower, learning the moods of the Pacific as it shifted from winter's gray violence to the gentler swells of warming waters. He had decided what to do with his mother's evidence. It had taken months of reflection, of conversations with Eleanor, of long hours sitting in the light room watching the beams sweep across the waters. But in the end, the decision had felt less like a choice than a recognition of something that had been true all along. He would not use the evidence for revenge. He would not destroy the Holloways or the Prescotts, would not watch their empires crumble while he stood in judgment over their fall. His mother had given him the power to do those things, but she had also given him something else, something more important, the wisdom to know that vengeance would not bring healing, that destruction would not restore what had been lost, that the cycle of harm could only be broken by someone choosing to step outside of it. Instead, working with Eleanor and a team of lawyers she had helped him find, Daniel had begun the slow, careful process of using the evidence to achieve a different kind of justice. They contacted the families who had been victimized by the land fraud over the generations, helped them understand what had been done to them, offered them the documentation they needed to pursue their own claims. They reached out to journalists and historians, providing information that would become part of the public record, ensuring that the truth would not be forgotten, even if formal prosecution proved impossible. And they negotiated with the Holloways and the Prescotts, not with threats, but with something subtler and more powerful, the offer of a path toward redemption. The families could fight the revelations, could spend years in courtrooms trying to suppress the truth, could watch their legacies crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Or they could acknowledge what had been done, make restitution to the families who had been harmed, and begin the long process of making amends. It was Marcus who brokered the arrangement with the Prescotts, who stood before his family's board of directors and argued for accountability, who helped establish a fund that would compensate victims and support the communities that had been exploited for generations. It was not enough to erase the past, could never be enough, but it was a beginning, a crack in the foundation of denial that had allowed the harm to continue for so long. The Holloways were harder. The patriarch of the family had died years ago, but his heirs had inherited his stubbornness along with his wealth, and they fought the revelations with all the resources at their disposal. But even they, eventually, were forced to reckon with the truth. The evidence was too thorough, too carefully documented, too widely distributed to be suppressed. And as the public became aware of what had been done, as the pressure for accountability grew, even the most resistant members of the family began to accept that their only path forward was acknowledgement and restitution. It took years. The process was slow and often frustrating, with setbacks and obstacles that sometimes made Daniel wonder if he had made the right choice, if simple revenge might not have been easier, cleaner, more satisfying. But each time he felt that temptation, he would climb to the top of the lighthouse and watch the beam sweep across the waters, and he would think of his mother, of the love that had driven her to protect him, of the hope she had expressed that he would use his power wisely. And he would remember that the lighthouse itself was a symbol, a guide for those who were lost, a light in the darkness that showed the way home. That was the legacy his mother had left him, not vengeance but illumination, not destruction but guidance, and that was the legacy he would honor. 10 years passed, and Daniel Chen stood at the top of Anchor Point Lighthouse on a soft May evening, watching the sun sink toward the Pacific in a blaze of gold and rose. The cottage below had been renovated over the years, expanded to include a small library that held the rare books collection he had accumulated, and a garden that had been restored to something approaching its original beauty by hands that had learned to love this place as much as his mother once had. He was not alone. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting in his, her silver-streaked hair catching the last of the evening light. They had met 5 years ago, when she had wandered into his bookshop on a rainy afternoon looking for something to read, and they had talked for hours that first day, discovering a connection that felt like something they had both been waiting for without knowing what it was. She was a teacher, a lover of poetry and history and long walks along the shoreline, and she had come to love the lighthouse as much as Daniel did, had helped him transform it from a place of secrets and pain into a home filled with warmth and light. And below them, in the cottage garden, their daughter played among the roses that Mei Lin had planted 30 years ago. She was 4 years old, with her father's gentle eyes and her mother's wild curls, and they had named her after the grandmother she would never meet but whose love had made her existence possible. Little Mei Lin Chen, running through the flowers in the golden evening light, laughing as the seabirds wheeled overhead and the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Daniel watched her play, feeling the weight of the years settling around him like a comfortable blanket, like the soft light of evening, like the peace that comes from finally understanding where you come from and who you are. The wounds of the past had not disappeared, not entirely. There were still moments when the old ache returned, still nights when he dreamed of the family that had raised him and the family that had abandoned him, and all the complicated love and loss that had shaped his existence. But the wounds had healed into scars, and the scars had become part of him, part of the story that had led him here, to this lighthouse on the headland, to this woman by his side, to this child in the garden below. The beam began its nightly rotation, sweeping out across the darkening waters, a rhythm that Daniel knew as well as his own heartbeat. The lighthouse still served its original purpose, still guided ships through the treacherous waters near the coast, still provided light for those who were lost, but it had become something else as well, something his mother might have hoped for but could never have predicted, a symbol of what was possible when love was stronger than fear, when forgiveness was chosen over revenge, when the past was honored without being allowed to dictate the future. Eleanor had died 2 years ago, peacefully in her sleep, at the age of 93. Daniel had been with her at the end, holding her hand as she slipped away, thanking her for everything she had done, for the decades of patience and faith, for keeping his mother's promise when it would have been so much easier to forget. She had smiled at him in those final moments, had squeezed his hand with surprising strength, had whispered something that sounded like completion, like fulfillment, like the last page of a story that had taken a lifetime to tell. Marcus came to visit sometimes, driving down from Cascade Ridge with his own family, his own children who played with little Maylene in the garden, while the adults sat on the cottage porch and talked about everything and nothing, rebuilding the relationship that had been broken so many years ago. Catherine had passed away the year before, and Marcus had stood beside Daniel at the funeral, two brothers who had finally found their way back to each other, honoring the woman who had been a mother to both of them, complicated and imperfect, but real. The Prescott Foundation, established with the settlement money from the land fraud cases, was now one of the largest charitable organizations in the region, providing scholarships and housing assistance and legal support to immigrant communities along the coast. The name had been deliberately chosen, an acknowledgement of the past and a commitment to a different future, and Daniel served on its board alongside people whose families had once been victimized by his adoptive family's crimes. It was not enough to undo the harm, could never be enough. But it was something, a lighthouse of its own kind, guiding the next generation toward waters less treacherous than those their ancestors had been forced to navigate. Sarah squeezed Daniel's hand as the last of the sun disappeared beneath the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Below them, little Mai Lin had stopped running and was standing very still, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the water with the rapt attention of a child encountering something magical for the first time. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, her voice soft in the evening quiet. Daniel was silent for a moment, watching his daughter, watching the light, thinking about all the years and all the people and all the love that had led to this moment. "I'm thinking about my mother," he said finally. "About what she might say if she could see all of this. The cottage, the garden, Mei Lin playing in the roses she planted. I'm thinking about whether she would be happy, whether this is what she hoped for when she built this place for me." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her warmth a comfort against the cool evening air. "I think she would be proud," she said. "I think she would look at you, at everything you've built, at the way you've chosen to live your life, and she would be so incredibly proud. You took the power she gave you and used it for healing instead of destruction. You broke the cycle. That's what she wanted, wasn't it? That's what the lighthouse was really for." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into his heart. The lighthouse was not just a building, not just a piece of property, not just a cache of hidden documents. It was a message, a promise, a testament to a mother's love that had reached across death and time to guide her son home. And now it was something else as well. A home for his own family, a beacon for his own future, a light that would continue to shine long after he was gone. Below, little Mei Lin began to run again, her laughter rising up through the evening air like music, like hope, like the beginning of a new story that would be written on the pages of years not yet lived. And Daniel watched her, his daughter named for the mother he had never known, running through the roses in the gathering dusk, and he felt the peace that comes from finally understanding that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The beam swept across the water, once, twice, 3 times, marking the rhythm of the night as it had for decades, as it would for decades more. And somewhere in the light, somewhere in the darkness between the pulses, Daniel could almost feel his mother watching, smiling, at rest at last because her son was home, because her lighthouse was still standing, because the love she had planted so many years ago was still growing, still blooming, still reaching toward the light. Night fell completely over Anchor Point, and the lighthouse beam became the only illumination in a world of gentle darkness. Daniel carried little Mei Lin inside when she grew tired, her small head resting against his shoulder, her breathing slow and even with the peace of childhood sleep. He laid her in her bed in the room that faced the sea, tucking the blankets around her, watching her face in the soft glow of the nightlight that cast stars across the ceiling. Sarah had gone downstairs to make tea, and the cottage was filled with the small sounds of evening, the distant crash of waves, the creak of old wood settling, the whisper of wind around the lighthouse tower. Daniel stood by his daughter's bed for a long moment, just watching her sleep, thinking about all. The nights his mother must have watched him the same way in those early years before she got sick, before she had to begin the terrible work of preparing for a future she would not live to see. "I understand now," he whispered, too quietly to wake her. "I understand why you did what you did, why you fought so hard, planned so carefully, left so much behind. It wasn't about the documents or the power or the revenge you never wanted me to take. It was about this moment, this peace. The knowledge that your child is safe, is loved, is sleeping soundly in a home that no one can take away. He bent down and kissed her forehead, so gently that she did not stir, and then he slipped out of the room and down the stairs to where Sarah was waiting with 2 cups of tea and a smile that never failed to make him feel like he had finally, after all the years of searching, found exactly where he belonged. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool night air, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead and the lighthouse beam sweep its eternal arc across the water. The tea was warm in Daniel's hands, and Sarah's presence beside him was a comfort that went beyond words, beyond thought, beyond anything he could have imagined in those dark days after he was written out of the will and cast out of the only family he had ever known. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah said, her voice soft in the darkness, "what your life would have been like if your mother had never bought this place? If she had never hidden the evidence, never made the deal with the Prescotts, never set all of this in motion?" Daniel considered the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by water. It was something he had thought about often, in the years since Eleanor had first walked into his bookshop and changed everything. What if Mei Lin had simply let go, had accepted that she was dying and that her son would have to make his way in the world without her protection? What if she had trusted fate instead of fighting it, had believed that Daniel would find his own path without the fortress of documents and legal arrangements she had built around him? "I think," he said slowly, "that the outcome might have been the same. Not the details, but the essence. I think that her love would have found a way to reach me no matter what. Even without the lighthouse, without the evidence, without all the complicated machinery she created. Her love was the real inheritance, and that was never hidden. It was there in the teacup she left me, in the photograph I kept beside my bed, in the knowledge that she had existed, that she had loved me, that I came from somewhere even when I didn't know where that somewhere was." Sarah took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. "That's a beautiful way to think about it." "It's the only way that makes sense," Daniel said. "All the rest, the power and the secrets and the justice and the forgiveness, those were just expressions of her love, ways of making it tangible, lasting, something I could hold on to. But the love itself was always the point. That's what she was really leaving me. Not a lighthouse, a light." They sat in silence as the night deepened around them, the beam continuing its sweep, the stars continuing their slow dance across the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded, low and mournful, and Daniel thought about all the sailors who had navigated these waters over the years, all the lives that had been saved by this light, all the journeys that had ended safely because someone had built a beacon on this headland, had tended the flame, had kept faith through storms and darkness that the light would be needed, would be seen, would guide someone home. That was the work of love, he realized. Not grand gestures or complicated plans, but simple faithfulness. Showing up day after day, year after year, tending the flame even when no one was watching, even when the storms raged and the darkness seemed impenetrable. His mother had done that work for him, had built this lighthouse and filled it with her love, had trusted that someday he would find it and understand. And now it was his turn to do the same, to tend the flame for his daughter, for the generations to come, for all the weary travelers who might need a light in the darkness. The beam swept across the water, once, twice, 3 times. Sarah's breathing had grown slow and even beside him, and Daniel realized that she had drifted off to sleep, her head resting against his shoulder, her face peaceful in the starlight. He did not wake her. Instead, he sat very still, watching the light, feeling the peace of this moment settle around him like a blanket, like a blessing, like the embrace of a mother he had never known, but who had loved him nonetheless. And in that quiet darkness, on the porch of a lighthouse that had been waiting for him all his life, Daniel Chen finally understood what his mother had been trying to tell him all along. The inheritance was never the documents or the property or the power they represented. The inheritance was this: the ability to love without condition, to protect without expectation of return, to build something beautiful and set it free into the world, trusting that it would find its way to the ones who needed it most. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the salt air fill his lungs, feeling the presence of all the love that had brought him here, feeling at last the peace of being exactly where he was meant to be. The lighthouse beam swept on through the darkness, guiding ships toward harbor, marking the way home. And somewhere in the light, somewhere in the space between the pulses, a mother's love continued its eternal watch, patient as the sea, constant as the stars, shining on and on into the endless night. Good night. The lighthouse stands, the light shines, the love remains. And you, listening to these words as sleep begins. To call you home, you are part of that light now. Let go of the day. Let go of the worries that cling to you. Let go of everything except the knowledge that you are held, you are watched over, you are loved. The waves are gentle tonight. The beams sweep soft across the water. The stars wheel slowly overhead. And in a cottage on a headland overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a family sleeps soundly, safe and warm, wrapped in the peace of knowing they are exactly where they belong. Close your eyes now. Feel the gentle rhythm of the waves. Feel the sweep of the light across your consciousness. Feel yourself drifting, floating, carried on currents of rest toward shores of deep and peaceful sleep. You are safe. You are loved. You are home. Let the lighthouse guide you now. Let the beam sweep away your worries. Let the love that has been hidden in plain sight all along wrap around you like a blanket, like a blessing, like the embrace of everyone who has ever loved you, everyone who loves you still. The night is gentle, the darkness is soft. Sleep is calling you home. Go now. Rest now. Dream of lighthouses and love and all the beautiful things that wait for those who are patient, who are kind, who trust that even in the darkness there is always a light. Good night, dear listener. Good night. The end.